Rice is a co-author on this work, as is Connie Woodhouse. Jen's actually on the phone as well, so she'll be able to help with questions in the question period. So if there's anything you want to ask Jen about, she will be here. Okay, so the project I'm going to talk about this morning, oops, sorry, let me get my slide going. Yeah, it's a couple years old, and the SARP program actually funded this work. And we had a really simple question at the heart of it, which was, how do collaborations between resource management professionals and scientists actually happen? So I've been working with the climate assessment for the Southwest program, or CLIMAS program, since 2007, as Kanan mentioned. I direct that program. CLIMAS is one of NOAA's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment, or RISA programs, which many of you probably know about. And as such, our mission is actually to do sort of climate research that's useful for decision making. So that's sort of our charge. So both Connie Woodhouse, again, she's a co-author on this work, and myself have worked for several years being involved in that kind of research. But we had frankly never really looked all that closely at exactly how the kinds of collaborations we've been involved with came about and how they evolved. So at that time, this project began in, I think, 2010. Jen Rice was finishing her PhD, or had just finished her PhD. Connie and I had both worked with Jen a little bit. And Jennifer was interested in writing a proposal for a postdoctoral research project. So actually, everything I'm going to talk about here is really research that Jen did the vast amount of most of the work. So I'm just sort of reporting on it. Okay, so here's what we decided to do. Basically, we decided we would focus on water utilities and climate researchers. We did this for a few reasons. First is that all three of us actually had some experience working in that domain. So we knew people, we had good connections. And also, we had a pretty good handle on the issues because we were doing it. Second, we knew that water managers, at least in the western U.S. where I work, I can speak to this, were a technically sophisticated community in terms of their ability to use and help produce climate information. So for us, that was sort of a boon because it was a sophisticated community. We sort of knew the issues. And so what we decided to do was a case study approach. And we chose our case studies. We chose Seattle, Denver, and Tucson, as indicated on this slide, primarily because we knew that in these three places there was lots of interactions between water managers, or at least the large water utilities in these cities, and climate researchers. And also, the water supply and the management systems and the climate in these three places are really different. So the cities gave us some diversity. And it's also worth mentioning that each of these cities, not coincidentally, at the time we started this research, each city had a RISA program attached to its local university. All right. Okay, so we had a couple of questions we really wanted to answer a little more specifically. And they are, generally they were how have water resource professionals and climate researchers in those three cities, Seattle, Denver, and Tucson, how these two communities interacted with one another, and then what are the most salient lessons that we can learn from these interactions. So how do we go about it? So our approach here was, it was a mixed method sort of social science project. Jen did about 30 interviews with water resource professionals and with climate researchers who, and both sides of, all the people she interviewed had, some amount of experience in these sort of science management collaborations. So we also formed and utilized a project advisory committee, and I'll talk about that in just a second in more detail. And then finally, at the end of the workshop, at the end of the project, we convened a final workshop with a blend of people who actually did participate in the project throughout. This was initially a 2-year project in terms of collecting data and stuff. So we had people who were part of that project at the workshop, and we also invited a group of experts, small group of experts that didn't take part in the project, but had lots of experience with this sort of researcher practitioner collaboration. At that workshop, we basically vetted the ideas we had come up with to that point. That was about 1.5 years into the project, I think. So we presented, in raw form what we had come up with to that point to this expert group, and then we also elicited information from that group beyond what we got to that point. So basically, we got information primarily from these three cities, but then we expanded that at the workshop because it was people from beyond those three cities. So we decided that it would be a good idea for this kind of project to put together this sort of advisory committee, this expert advisory committee. So what we chose to do was we picked a water resource professional and a climate researcher in each of our case cities. So in Seattle, it's Paul Fleming from Seattle Public Utility, and Easton Over from University of Washington. In Denver, it was Lorna Cates from Denver Water, and Jeff Lucas from University of Colorado. And in Tucson, it was initially Ralph Mara from Tucson Water and my colleague Greg Garfin here at the University of Arizona. Ralph actually retired partway through the project, so Rice Lindley wound up being our he swapped in at the end there. So with this group of people that you're looking on the slide, there's tons of experience, many collective years of experience doing this collaborative work between water resource professionals and specifically climate scientists. So how we utilize them, we use them a couple different ways. We met with them a couple times. I think we had a couple calls with them. We certainly had at least one or maybe even two in-person meetings with them. And then as we were developing most of what I'm going to present in the rest of this talk, they provided a huge amount of feedback and guidance, actually. They were sort of like our go-to peer review crew, and they've done a fabulous job at that. So if any of them are on the phone, I thank you very much. Okay, so from the beginning of the project, we committed to the funder, to Nancy, to the SARP program, and to ourselves to, among the things, the deliverables we would produce, we decided we wanted to do a sort of handbook of practical information, partly because, as I alluded to earlier, Connie and I had quite a bit of experience doing this work, but there's not a whole lot of sort of guidance out there, very practical information. There's a ton of academic information. There's not that much practical information about how these kind of collaborations work. So that's what we did. What you're looking at is a screenshot of the cover of that. It's on that. It's available at that URL that's just to the right of the cover shot. I will warn you, I just posted it yesterday, so Google might not find it yet. So write down the URL, or we can distribute the URL or something. The trick here is that this handbook we try to write it in such a way that it's useful for researchers and practitioners, not written for one side or the other. I mean, really, it's written in doesn't have a single citation in it. It's not an academic publication. We really aimed it at being a practical set of advice. Okay, so what it amounts to, for the most part, most of the handbook, which is really actually pretty short, it's about 20 pages, is really 10 heuristics, what we're calling 10 heuristics to guide scientist-practitioner collaboration. So why did we choose the term heuristics? Well, because they're not really rules, they're not principles, they're not even really guidelines. I mean, essentially what we came up with, because we engaged with quite a large number of experts, we got a bunch of rules of thumb, and we distilled them down to these 10, and they came from trial and error learning from, like I said, a large group of experts. So, again, we wanted to take what we learned and turn it into something simple, although thoughtful and insightful, but practical information for folks who want to engage in this kind of collaborative work. So that's what the handbook is, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I don't have time to walk through all 10 of them, and I'm sure I would bore you to tears on a webinar doing that, but I'm going to hit you with the first 5 that we came up with, just in order. I just picked the first 5, just to give you a sense of what's actually in that handbook to see if it's something you might be interested in. Okay. So our sort of heuristic number 1, and I'll define what I'm talking about here in a sec. Preconditioning activities can set the stage for collaboration. So what we're thinking about here is not necessarily intentional actions to start collaborating between water resource people and climate scientists. It's actually, it turns out in a lot of cases, projects that wind up becoming quite intense collaborations, a lot of them have this origin story of more casual get-to-know-you kind of stuff. It comes from maybe serving on committees together or something, or being at the same meetings, or just through professional networking, or even because we're co-located in the same town, knowing people socially. So we found that a lot of groundwork actually winds up getting done this way. So we called all that stuff this sort of non-intentional get-to-know-you kind of stuff, preconditioning. And in the handbook, it's explained a little bit more what we're talking about. So this picture here is not actually from this work. It's a recent picture from last fall, and it shows the director of the environmental program for the Southern Arizona Regional Planning Authority. Her name is Claire Zucker, and myself chatting at a workshop that we both helped to plan. So we actually got to know each other pretty well through that workshop planning process, and have since been discussing, working together on a much larger, much more complicated, much more involved project. So I'd argue that that time that Claire and I spent over the last year or so talking about the workshop, about the local politics surrounding climate change and sustainability and all this stuff that, she and I spent a lot of time on the phone and in meetings together, that helped establish the groundwork for a fairly complex collaboration that we're now starting to plot. So I think that is emblematic of the kind of preconditioning stuff we're talking about. Okay, our heuristic number 2, information brokers are central to successful collaborations. So at least in the water management and the climate science communities, there's a handful of people who are super adept at working back and forth across this kind of conceptual boundary that exists between science and resource management. So this is a group of people, again, it's a pretty small group of people actually, at least in these two communities. But these folks have really unique skills, like being able to put emerging research in the context of an existing body of knowledge. So where does this new discovery fit into all the other stuff we've known for years in the science side of it, and also into larger questions and management challenges, and even in some cases, how that kind of information might work with management tools. So these people are really good at essentially being translators back and forth between management and science. So the two people in this picture are, on the top, it's Mike Crimmins, who's one of my colleagues here at the University of Arizona, and he's actually a climate extension specialist. He's on our faculty. He's a tenured faculty member in a department. But part of his, instead of having teaching responsibility, part of his job is actually going out into communities across Arizona and essentially brokering climate information for people who need it or want to engage with that kind of science. On the bottom is Lorna Cates, who is actually on our project advisory committee, and she has an interesting position in that she is a climate scientist working for Denver Water's planning division. So again, both Lorna and Mike are sort of outwardly facing. In Lorna's case, part of her job is facing my community, the climate research community. In Mike's case, he's a climate researcher and he's sort of facing out to consumers of information. Okay, so you'll notice these are one person from academia, one person from water management. Okay, heuristic number 3, building capacity to work across science practice boundary is critical. So what we're talking about here, this idea of building capacity to work in this boundary space, conceptual boundary space, it's about conscientiously focusing on learning how to do this kind of stuff. Again, this is what we were thinking about with this handbook in general, was there's not a lot of advice out there for how you actually do this. Most people, I stumbled into it, most of us stumble into it. We're not trained to do it necessarily. So the building capacity part, individually, it's about consciously focusing on learning how to do it, seeking out things like this webinar, this handbook, and trying to learn from others who have some experience doing it. And then within an organization, because you're really trying to build individual capacity, but you're also trying to get your organization to clue into the importance of this kind of stuff. Because I don't have time, but our rationale here was in these kind of really complex challenges like we work in, climate change or drought or sustainability issues, they're really complicated problems. So you really need both practitioners and scientists sort of engaging, because neither community can fully sort of solve these problems. In fact, they're not necessarily solvable problems. So you want to kind of be able to get your organization to understand that it's helpful to have these collaborations and to be flexible. So we have, we found that there are people who are not only focusing on learning how to do it themselves, but they're also trying to get their organization to pay attention to it. So specifically, there's opportunities for cross-training. There are some funding opportunities, in fact, to do this sort of cross-training as people get finish a PhD. You can do postdoctoral work sort of embedded in a resource management agency, that kind of thing. Interns or externships, they're out there mostly for students, not so much for mid-career professionals like myself, but maybe that could exist. And then also this sort of institutional proselytizing about collaborative work. If you have somebody who's jazzed about this kind of stuff in your organization and they're talking about it a lot, hopefully the idea there is you can build capacity in the organization to support it better. So the sort of random picture on this slide is one of my colleagues here at University of Arizona, Kiyomi Marino. So Kiyomi is actually a tree ring scientist. She does, among the things she does, is sort of reconstruction of stream flow. But Kiyomi's been working for several years with the Bureau of Reclamation's Lower Colorado River Basin Office. And that group is actually pretty darn progressive in terms of climate information. And Kiyomi actually had to learn how their operational model works and how it runs. So I would argue that she was sort of cross-trained in BOR culture as a tree ring scientist, so that she could figure out how our data, the UA kind of data, could fit into operations. So she took that initiative herself, or it was at least part of her job in that project. Okay, heuristic number 4. Catalyzing events provide prime opportunities for collaboration. So we highlight in our handbook, because Connie Woodhouse was instrumental in, over the last little bit more than a decade now. Connie has been really, a lot of you probably know her, and a lot of you probably know her for the work she's done as a tree ring scientist, helping water management professionals all through the West actually figure out what they can get out of tree ring data. So one of part of that genesis story of that work is the early 2000s drought was pretty darn bad here in the Intermountain West. And you see on the NCDC figure I have here, this is statewide precipitation ranks. And you see that Colorado, it's the driest year on record is 2002. So it's not coincidental that that's the year that Connie starts working with water managers, because essentially you have the water management community saying, holy crap, this is terrible, like how bad can it get? And they essentially came to tree ring scientists, to paleoclimate researchers, and said, and people who could do paleohydrology, and said, well, how, we have 120 years of record, what can you guys give us? And thus started a whole corner of Connie's career working with water management. So she and the water management community at that time in Colorado really capitalized on that event. I mean, that sounds kind of callous, but the drought event really got those two communities working together. So more recently, we've had this sort of interesting phenomena develop in the East Coast. This is not part of this project, but this is much more temporally relevant. So just a couple years ago, when Hurricane Sandy hit, you had this massive amount of activity that started to happen, partly because Bloomberg was supporting it, where my colleagues in New York City and all up and down the East Coast, specifically Cynthia Rosenberg and Bradley Horton at Columbia University, all of a sudden they are inundated, no pun intended, because of course this was a terrible flood event. They were inundated with a lot of new work, sort of collaborative work with planners and politicians, because they were freaked out by the storm and the potential that it revealed. So these catalyzing events actually wind up becoming really good fodder for these kind of intense collaborations. Okay, so finally, successful collaboration requires mutual respect, blah, 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 right? That just sounds like the kind of crap you hear all the time. What does that actually mean? And interestingly enough, it kept, even though it sounds so pro forma and sounds so cliche, it kept coming up over and over again. And it is interesting to me that the idea here, this goofy cartoon, is, there's just no room for a know-it-all in these kind of complicated integrated problem-solving projects. There's just no room for the guy or gal who knows everything. And so, I mean, I think the lesson here is you can't be a know-it-all. You have to have mutual respect. But importantly, and this is really cute for scientists, I think, we're trained, and you spend so many years of your life becoming educated and learning all about an issue, and very frequently you know a ton about one really specific thing. But that expertise actually turns out to be only, a lot of times it's only a little bit useful for these big value-laden problems. So, successful collaboration requires mutual respect, but essentially it comes down to humility is good, and that's on both sides of the equation here. But scientists are often pretty guilty of not being humble. Okay, so those are 5 of the 10 that are in this handbook, and I tried to sort of give you a quick conclusion here. I mean, one basic thing that jumps out from this work is, research. My group and a lot of us across the country who do climate research at this moment in time, we're trying to figure how do you make this stuff useful for decision making? How do you make sure that you're creating stuff that isn't just buried in a journal? And it's such a politically fraught environment and all that stuff. So, I mean, I think what we can say from what we found, one thing we can say is that, research can be more useful if purposeful, like focused work is done by participants from both sides of this sort of conceptual divide to shrink the gap. It's basically a gap between the way that we frame a question or think about the answer we need and the kind of stuff we want to know, and the management communities think about it. I mean, there's a pretty substantial gap there. And it's not like one side knows more than the other. It's just that we think about the problems quite a bit differently because of what we do. So I think the big thing for me is, we have to recognize there is a gap. You got to be humble about the knowledge you bring to the table. And you've got to be constantly aware of the really complicated nature of trying to use science to solve social or political problems. I mean, it is fraught activity, and these collaborations are right in the middle of it. And so you have to be really sensible about how you're going to do it. But again, the whole thing is trying to shrink that gap between the way that we conceptualize these problems. Okay, so one last plug for this. So all 10 of the heuristics, plus there's some other stuff in there, a lot more context about how we got to where we got to with this. In this handbook, again, that URL is available. That URL is there, the report, the PDF is there. And then finally, I just want to give a quick thanks to lots of people. Like I said, Nancy's the Sectoral Applications Research Program funded this work. And again, it was Jen Rice who did all of the research I've just reported here. And then also our Project Advisory Committee, who I mentioned earlier, provided a tremendous amount of advice and feedback. And then there was about 45 people in total between the interviews and the workshop who shared their knowledge and experience, and we sort of, pilfered their knowledge to get to where we are. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I actually attended the final workshop for this project and found it very useful, and I'm glad that there is a handbook available online.
It is,
as a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them in the questions chat box. We will have a question and answer section after the second presentation. Our second talk is titled 5 Americas for Community Water and Climate Change, a nationally representative segmentation analysis, and it will be given by Karen Raucher. Karen is a senior associate with Stratus Consulting. Her area of expertise focuses on how information can be both gathered and shared to create support for policy decisions concerning complex issues in the water sector, with an emphasis on climate change and adaptation planning. Today she'll be talking about a project that was funded by the Water Research Foundation. Karen, it is all yours.
Thank you, Kanan. Thank you for everyone for taking the time to listen to this morning. I'm excited to share the results of a research project we've been involved in called Effective Climate Change Communication for Water Utilities. And today, as part of this webinar, I'm just going to share one particular part of our research, and that was a national survey. Click, or do you want to give me either way? I want to start right off by thanking the Water Research Foundation for even thinking this was important, for understanding that effective communication about climate change for water utilities is a vital part of how they're going to approach adapting. We had a great project manager and PAC team, but I also want to give a real shout out to our project team, particularly Anthony Lyserowitz from Yale, who was very involved in developing the survey and the survey questions, as well as the many other people on our team and our numerous colleagues at Stratus. Click. So do I now have control? Okay, here's, but even more importantly, we had these 13 water utilities who hung in there with us from the very beginning to make sure that what we were talking about was really pragmatic and was really dealing with the issues they were facing, not what we thought they were going to be. And so I really thank them for their time and energy in this project. Click. The project goal was simple. It was to help come up with some strategies that utilities could use to overcome climate change communication barriers. Click. Today I don't have time to share all the products. It was a 3-year project, and we came up with some wonderful tools that utilities can use, a message mapping tool and an informational series they can use to share and increase the knowledge internally. But today I'm going to focus on the national survey, and if we have time I'll just tell you about the other tools a little bit. Click. So I'm going to start with, as I said, I'm focusing on the survey. And the purpose of the survey was really to say, what do Americans really think about climate change when you add the concept of community water? How does that change the conversation? Click. One of the first things we ask is how much you trust water utilities to do things. And you can see from this slide that if you're a water utility professional, you should be extremely proud of yourself. The American public really trusts you. They trust you to give you enough, to provide enough water at all times, to make sure that water is safe and healthy. They even trust you to provide them with information about issues that will affect their water supply, and they will do this. They know that you will trust you to do this at a reasonable cost. I want to just digress for a minute. I forgot to say that we asked 3 kinds of questions as part of this survey. This survey was actually conducted April of last year. It was based on a computer survey platform that the GfK corporate organization runs, used to be known as Knowledge Network. And what they do is that they have a panel of people that are available to take surveys. And they can select from that panel the people they need, and they can weight it to make sure that you're really representing America and not just getting some random sample. So it's a random sample that's representative of America. And as part of putting this survey together, we wanted to identify Americans' attitudes, beliefs, and actions about climate change and community water. And so in order to do that, we asked 3 types of questions. We asked questions about your water utility. We asked questions about beliefs, attitudes, and actions about climate change. And then we asked questions regarding the nexus of the 2. So this is one of the first kinds of questions that we asked just regarding water. And it was fascinating to find out how much Americans trust you. Click. It was also interesting to see that Americans really support their water provider planning for the future. They understand that water isn't just going to be available forever. It's going to take some work on your part as a utility manager to ensure that there's water there. Click. We are also fascinated by the fact that 3/4 of Americans want their water utility to pay attention to climate change is one of the things they think about when they're planning for the future. Starting at the other end from climate change, ensuring water quality treatment facilities are adequate, 95% of Americans are behind that. It's not quite clear to me why the other 5%, what they're thinking. You don't want your water to be of high quality. And clearly rates are high, and we were kind of surprised that people understand the need to improve the aging water delivery system. But the biggest takeout from this is 3/4 of Americans already support their water utility thinking about climate change as they plan for the future. Click. And if the money is needed and would be spent wisely and efficiently, almost 3/4 also are willing to pay extra each month right now. And we did ask willingness to pay questions along with this, and I'll give you some of that in the past. But basically, the 69% said they're willing to pay up to at least $3 a month, and then there's quite a large group that's willing to pay more as well. Click. But this was a real insight. Although they all want you to, there's only a very small group understands whether you actually have a plan prepared. And we ask a number of these questions about planning. This one particularly that I pulled out is adequately prepared for extreme weather. This seems to be something that I would have assumed my water utility was prepared for, but many Americans across the country don't have a clue whether you've made a plan or not. And this is really important because as you're communicating information about climate change, here's an opportunity. People want you to be preparing for extreme weather. They want you to include consideration of climate change, and yet they don't know whether or not you're actually doing it. And so this is an opportunity to give them something they want. And these kinds of opportunities don't come often, but they resonate really well. Click. I have to say it's really hard to give a presentation when I can't see the audience. So then we also ask how concerned you are about future extreme weather events' impact on safe, healthy drinking water. And Americans are clearly really concerned that extreme weather events will impact their safe drinking water. Click. And they also really understand that extreme events will make this more difficult, or that climate change impact on extreme events will make it more difficult. And this is not what we expected to see. When we began the process of putting together this survey, we asked our utilities what they thought would be the answer to these questions. And they said the majority of our audience in our community and in our internal staff are angry and dismissive about climate change, and so we can't talk about it at all. And so as I go through this, use that as your initial starting point and think about how different these results actually are than what we anticipated, and certainly the utilities anticipated they would be. Click. And that Americans are willing to pay more to ensure that you're prepared for future extreme weather events. This was a really fascinating set of answers. And the question is, how much do you trust or distrust the following source of information about climate change on your local water system? And typically we assume that the most trusted sources for most things fall out to be friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Whether they know anything about it or not, we tend to trust the people we know. And so if you're anywhere close to friends, neighbors, and colleagues, you're considered a very trusted source. And it cracks me up to look at how well people trust their local officials, their local news media, even the environmental groups. But it's water utilities who they trust. And because we have a margin of error of 3 or 4 plus or minus, you're really at the same trusted source as your local state or university and the local climate expert. So this entails a sense of responsibility. If someone trusts you to do something, then you need to ensure that you have the ability to follow through on that. So this finding was very powerful. Click. But this is the bottom line of our research finding. 92% of Americans want their community water utility to play a leadership role in preparing their community for the impacts of climate change. And when I can see my audience, and it's a group of utilities, at this point, many of them their mouths are open, they're sitting at the edge of their seat, they're saying, really? We assumed this pie chart would be the opposite, that 8% of Americans would want us to play a leadership role, and 92% of Americans would really like us to stay out of the conversation. And so this is really an important finding. Click. One of the things people always want to know is, well, that's great at a national level, but my region's very different. We asked 120 questions, and there were only 2 that had statistically significant differences by region. And note, we selected these regions because they're the census data, and that's what our survey data was sorted by, so it was more difficult to break it down into smaller regions. But if you look at this first one, this is how concerned are you that future extreme weather events will impact community water providers' ability to provide safe, healthy drinking water. This upper Midwest region is the only region that is a little less concerned about this than the rest of the nation. We did not ask follow-up questions to this, so I can't give you a data-based answer to this. In asking utilities in that region, they say, you know, we just haven't had those kinds of experiences in the past. And that's clearly changing with the level of drought and flooding that's occurring there now. Click. The only other significant regional difference was the impact of climate change on impact on extreme weather events. And the West has a much stronger understanding that climate change will have a significant impact. And I think that's because this is already occurring to such a large degree. They're already so sensitive to climate, water and climate. So, but the real point of this is none of the other answers I've shown you or the rest of the research has regional differences. So click. So the next thing we did is we wanted to say, okay, well, here's good broad statistics of the answers. How can we use this information to assist people in developing messages that will really resonate with the people they want to talk to? And we used the approach used by the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, Anthony Lyserowitz, that you may be familiar and may have seen some of his research on the 6 Americas. And what he has done is take these segments, these answers to his questions, and segment the answers so that they represent groups. So the alarmed group in here is the group that answers the climate change questions. They are strongly concerned about it. They understand that it's human caused, and they're taking actions actually today to punish companies. Whereas at the other end, the dismissive do not believe climate change is occurring and actually believe it's a conspiracy. And then there's levels in between. I don't have time to go into the 6 Americas today because I want to go to the next slide and talk to you about the 5 Americas. So click. what we did is take the same kind of segmentation tools to look at the answers and say, what are the 5 Americas when you introduce community water? How does that change that American set of beliefs, actions, and attitudes when you introduce the concept of community water? And you can see here that it changes it pretty significantly. Our advocates are your group of Americans that are strongly convinced our climate is changing, and also have a strong conviction that it's human caused. Your supporters group, and the advocates are also the choir for the utility. You ask them for money, they will be there and give it to you. They understand that it's needed, and they will provide it. The supporters have many of the same attributes as your advocates, but they're a little less strong. They understand that the climate is changing, but maybe they are, it's not their biggest concern. It's one of their, it's a concern, but it's a somewhat concern rather than highly concerned. This group also had a broader range of understanding of attribution. There is a large group of supporters who just aren't quite sure whether it's human or environment or what's causing it. None of the supporters believe it's a conspiracy. Your skeptical supporters is an interesting group in that they actually are willing to support utilities with their payments for climate change related actions at the same level or a little higher than advocates. They just aren't quite as convinced climate change is happening. But they trust the water utility at such a high level that they want to support whatever you ask for. You don't ask for a lot, and if you ask me for something, it's about climate change. Even if I'm not sure whether climate change is real or not, I'm going to provide you the support. So when you look at these first 3 groups, you have almost 75% of the population, 3/4 of the population, who are supportive today, right now, of water utilities preparing for climate change and spending money to do so. And that's a pretty dramatic finding. Most people are not as interested, even though that's the group that you're probably going to message to because it's your largest group. If you can get that group, you can probably pass what you need to pass. You're going to get your rate approvals to do it. If those are the groups you're probably targeting with your communication. But most people are much more interested in the closed wallet and the pessimist group. So click, I'm going to give you a little bit about each of those groups. The closed wallets were interesting. They were actually unwilling to pay for anything extra that a water utility asked for. And luckily we asked why, and 50% basically said, I don't have enough money. And the rest is pretty evenly distributed as to why. Now when we look at the income distribution of people who fall into this segmentation, we find that although they're a larger portion of the segment has lower income, there's still a significant portion of this group that makes over $100,000 a year. So not having enough money is not the total answer to them. But this is an interesting group defined by their willingness to pay. Click. This was one of our funny findings. So people least likely to pay or least wanting to pay for utility actions are the most likely group to buy bottled water. We did look to see if this group had some cultural association. We know that people who come from cultures where the water that comes out of your tap is not potable have a tendency to purchase bottled water even when they're in America, but there was no cultural correlation with closed wallets. But it's just kind of a funny fact. Click. The next group is the pessimists. And I always want to start off by saying this is only 8% of your group. So even though this is a group that you're concerned with, it's a very small segment. And interestingly enough, 41% of this group is still willing to pay $3 more per month to ensure there's abundant, safe water in the future. Click. But they're fatalists. third of this group doesn't think there is anything much a water utility provider can do to protect their local water supply from extreme events. You can't fortify the structures, you can't move the generators up a level, you can't ensure you have a backup system. So I thought this finding really defines this group well. Click. Unfortunately for water utility managers, by a very large margin, this is the group most likely to show up at a water utility meeting. And so when we go back to that idea that water utility managers stated in the beginning, I can't talk about climate change because everybody in my group, everybody in my community is angry and upset when I talk about climate change. This may be part of the reason, because the people who show up at the meeting are angry and negative about climate change. So click. As part of our research, we also tested 3 messages. Each message talks about, for example, the water cycle message talks about how climate change will impact the water cycle and how that will make it more difficult for water utilities. The extreme event talks about how climate change will make extreme events more difficult for water utilities to plan for. Same kind of message. The separation message basically said, it is possible to separate out the fact that our climate is changing from the discussion of why it is changing and what we should do about it. So click. Note that each one of these messages was 3 to 4 sentences long, very short paragraph. Each one of these messages provided an incredibly significant increase in support as response to climate change. So when you look at this, it looks like separation is perhaps the best message to use, but click. But what you really want to do is look at how the messages resonated by audience group. So if what you're really trying to do is get those closed wallets to open their wallets, then yes, that separation message is definitely the one you want to go with. If you're really trying to get your advocates to open up their wallets, then you may want to go with the water cycle message. We didn't have an opportunity to test what would happen if you did some combination of messages, and clearly that's something you would want to test. I do like to point out that although the pessimist several of the messages decreased, the separation message actually increased their support for climate change, and this was fairly astonishing because everything else you ask them about climate change reduces their support. So this is a good way to talk about climate change with that pessimist group. Click. And as you can see, that's exactly what you get. When you look at the willingness to pay questions, you get the most increase from the closed message. Now note that they started by saying they were unwilling to pay anything, so it's easier to move up when you start at 0, and your advocates started much higher. Click. So here's my conclusion. This is very important to understand that you are a trusted source of information about climate change. Click. I think until today, there are very few trusted sources of climate change that have been identified. Americans support your thinking about climate change and extreme event preparation, and they're willing to pay for it right now if you ask them. Click. A well-designed message clearly increases support. Talking about it is not a negative. In fact, talking about it brings you benefits. Click. Americans trust you to have their back, but they aren't sure if you have a plan. Use this as a real opportunity. This is an inroad. Click. And use data. Don't rely on your gut instinct. We all respond to everything from our small number of interactions. So if you're interacting with that 8% who show up at your water utility meeting all the time, then they're the ones that you're going to respond to. Use data to understand the broader audience. Click. And if anybody's interested, there are water utilities who are following up on this and are really excited about using this to build support. And the basic idea they've come up with is we're going to have to do some fairly unpopular things to meet the needs of climate change in the future. And what we want to do right now is to begin to build that understanding that our actions are required by educating our audience. Click. This is another tool. Click. And we've developed a 12-step message mapping program to help you develop good messages. It's in the report. Anybody who's trying to communicate this process will really help you ensure that you're meeting the needs of your audiences. Click. And I always leave this up here because anybody who has any kind of a relationship with a spouse or partner or children understands that sometimes the idea that you have communicated is merely an illusion. So be sure and evaluate and look at what you've done. Click. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Now I'm going to turn the microphone to Nancy. I think we have some questions, don't we?
Yes, we do. They're coming in, and send them in, and we'll get through them as quickly as we can. The first question is for Dan, and Dan, there was a question: what was the biggest surprise from the project? Any finding that you didn't expect in building the research practitioner collaboration?
Oh, that's a great question. Biggest surprise. Jen's here too, so she could weigh in. Biggest surprise. Well, you know what's interesting is we kept, in fact, in just the last couple of weeks in getting the handbook done, I got it reviewed again by our advisory committee. And one of our water manager advisors came back at me again, sort of reinforcing the main point, which was that there is this pretty big cultural divide between the two communities. And I guess I was a little surprised at how strongly that came out. I mean, it's sort of obvious when you stop and think about it, but it was a big deal. People talked about it every time we talked, you know, like in groups and workshops. That came up a lot. This cultural divide was an important thing, that academics think about things obviously differently than water managers. It's kind of a lame answer. Jen, you have anything?
Well, I was just thinking something slightly different, which is that in terms of strategies for having successful collaborations, at some level they were all already intuitive and sort of things that, you know, that weren't surprises. So that was in its own way a surprise about kind of building these relationships that will facilitate a successful collaboration. But of course, those things that lead to them that we lay out in the handbook are systematically devalued, underfunded, you know, not emphasized. So that's what I was thinking more, that when we got the results, they were sort of things that weren't totally, you know, they were things you could have almost anticipated without doing the research, but the degree to which they're not formally implemented or valued was very evident. That's you think that's fair, Dan?
That's a much better answer. Good job.
I don't know. Great.
Okay, our next question, we actually have two of them for Karen. Can we go over again what you mean by separation in the section on messaging?
Sure. What we were trying to do is provide people with the idea that you can think about climate change and believe in the idea that our climate is changing without having to be involved in the discussion of why is our climate changing? Is it human caused? They don't have to take responsibility. And they don't have to get caught up in whether we're going to have a carbon tax and what that's going to do for businesses. So the message was basically said, it is possible to think about think about climate change and understand that climate is changing without being involved in the discussion of who is responsible and what we should be doing about it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Dan and Jen. Did you document any specific meetings or workshop design aspects that help folks bridge divides? For example, tools for enhancing interactions.
We didn't. Jen, do you want to take that one? We didn't really do that, did we?
Yeah, we were looking more retrospectively at the activities that these people had already engaged in. So so what we did in the handbook is we sort of have some like helpful hints or key tips, sort of some things that you can kind of try to do, like action items, I think is what they were called at one point. But I think to the degree we kind of give these generic, broad categories of actions or activities that you can undertake is the most we address that particular issue.
Yeah, it's true. We didn't really go into the weeds on, like, you know, this kind of facilitate discussion versus that kind. It's much broader than that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Karen, here's just someone made a comment. You don't need to respond to this unless you want to. It just said that care should be used to differentiate climate change and global warming. Sometimes this distinction creates confusion.
You know, I would like to respond in that Tony's questions, and they may be responding to this, some of Tony's questions use global warming as opposed to climate change. And his research has shown that his results come up the same no matter which term he uses. And so other than that, we used climate change throughout.
Okay, thank you. And people can still type their questions. We only have a couple more to get through. And Karen, I think this is for you. Why are the pessimists coming to the meetings, and what do they care about? Will they definitely respond well to data?
No, my guess is they will not respond to data. This is a group that has such strong convictions about their position that they tend to not listen to other people. They are there to tell you what is right, and they know what is right. So one of the things we did for water utilities is to say it's really important that you understand how to address these people, because your goal is never to convince someone that the climate is changing. Your goal as a water utility professional is to prepare for the climate effects on water. And so your goal when you're talking to these people is to acknowledge them politely and keep the conversation moving forward. And there is a toolkit on how to do that as part of the paper.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, are we going to provide the slides following the presentations? We are, and we don't know the exact website right now, so Amrit is going to show you on the screen where you can go to pick these up. But even better, this time we did a recording of this particular webinar, except for the first minute or so, and so you'll be able to relive this on the web once we get it up. But for those that do want copies of the PowerPoints, it's on the Climate Program Office. It'll be on the Climate Program Office website, which is cpo.noaa.gov. But then, if you look on the right-hand side, you can see it's highlighted there, the webinar series all the way at the bottom. But we're going to take you to the exact page, and if you want to write down where that is, we forgot to write it down. It's under SARP, yeah. And then you know it better than I do. Okay. And I should just also say that we have not formally introduced him, but Amrit Sagar is in the room with us, and he's really the mastermind behind everything that's working well. So, are there any other, so you can see that's the page for all the webinars and workshops. If you don't already get an announcement about what's coming up, we'll have 2 more webinars in May, one in May and one in June, and then we're going to take a summer break. So you can always look there to see what our next one will be, and we try to post them. So Amrit is showing you where that is. Does anyone have any final questions? Otherwise, I'm going to turn it back to Kanan.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Nancy. And I want to thank Dan, Jennifer, and Karen for their great presentations. I really enjoyed listening to the presentations. And on behalf of sponsors, I want to thank you all for joining us for this month's climate webinar. As Nancy mentioned, our climate webinar series will continue in May and June. And we'll be sharing the final program for May later this month. And please either check the website, or if you are in the distribution list that Nancy sends the email, you'll be receiving the final program for May from her. Again, thank you for joining us. Have a nice day.